So the thing that's been kind of profoundly going through my head and how you guys are carrying on conversation is we as humans working in very specific sports kind of have some stereotypical movement patterns, stereotypical dysfunctions. You mentioned thoracic issue. I would presume, much like wrestlers, there's probably a lot of thoracic tension in fighters because of internal, external rotation, lots of pushing, limited pulling, right? So when you get stuck in that scapular or a lack of being able to scapularly pull back, right? I think that it's tough. Like you were saying, well, what would you do? And Yul and I talk about this a lot. You don't want to make changes to an athlete that you know will affect their performance, but you're trying to make changes that will hopefully enable them to be better within their performance.
Yep.
I'm sure you've kind of developed some standards, and being a PT, you know range of motion, you know what's within healthy range. But specifically with these fighters, what do you see from a thoracic standpoint? Limitation, dysfunction, etc.
So one of the things I think that definitely jumps to my mind is, you know, like you said, that forward rounded shoulder posture. I mean, they're so used to always, you know, protecting their face. So their hands are forward. They're always in that protective mechanism, and they train multiple hours, 3 hours a day in that. We see scapulas that are just completely rounded and, you know, not moving. We see dysfunction then that happens at the shoulder because they're so anterior that, you know, the glenohumeral and scap ratios are completely off. We see because they're so rounded and protracted forward that they reduce the amount of thoracic mobility and cervical mobility. Because if you're forward, they also tend to be very heavy chest breathers when they get more of that fight or flight. They lose some of that really good breathing mechanics. So their rib cage is elevated. Their first ribs are elevated. They're protracted with their scaps, you know, and all of that ends up turning into dysfunction of not being able to move through thoracic when they're punching. So then we're seeing cervical disc because their cervical is trying to work. And then we also see lumbar discs because they're anteriorly pelvic tilted at the hips. They're protracted so this kyphotic positioning. So, you know, you take a look at them and I think all three of us would immediately say, okay, that obviously is your position of performance and that's where you need to be able to get. But how do you counterbalance that so those joints don't wear down from doing the same motions and protecting those same things? So, you know, working on breathing patterns, getting the rib cage down, especially in between rounds. We're looking at, you know, how do we strengthen, like you said, so many of it is pushing, not a lot of pulling. So I try to work with our strength and conditioning team to make sure even in their warm-ups, we're looking at prevention. So I know that if they're always rounded, they're going to probably wear through their supraspinatus, possibly into labrums and become shoulder injuries. So now when they're doing just their general warm-ups for strength and conditioning, or even their warm-ups before they're going to do rounds, that it counterbalances those. And that's kind of, I mean, I think in general, we look at the body as a big pulley system. If we know that everything is in the front and doing something, then it's our due diligence to, when they're warming up, when they're doing strength and conditioning, when they're doing prevention, rehab, that we counterbalance those so that we don't lead down that injury lane.
I think a lot of professionals might say, okay, let's work on scapular retraction. Let's work on a neutralized pelvis. And that might sound great on paper, and it might actually make the human better per se, but it won't necessarily make for a better fighter, right? Because there's that balance. And you said there might be a preference based on how they fight to be protracted, but protracted might allow them to strike faster. And if we try to pull those scapula back and get into a retracted state or even a more neutralized state,
we're going against what they're trying to do. It could
slow them down. It could actually limit performance. And then the cart kind of falls back on you. Well, you know, why did you try to change this athlete so much? Sometimes we just have to make minor modifications. Mm-hmm. Let it kind of be the way that it is and understand that, okay, so we're going to have to be very proactive about therapy. We're going to have to be proactive about rehabilitation and proactive about, even if it's myofascial release, to try to just give this athlete the best ability to function within their state.
Yeah. And I think it's important that I think it's a really good point that we strengthen them also in those positions. Like, we want to increase their power and speed in those positions because that's where they're going to be in a fight. But I think it's a matter of the body needs to be able to get in and get out of positions and effectively. So we might want to train them to generate more power in that position, but then we also want to be able to untrain them so that those muscles can rest. Because if everything is turned on, those muscles are eventually not going to be able to stay turned on forever. They have to be able to get in a resting state to recover, or that's when we see these chronic injuries that occur. So I think it's like a point of training in those positions where needed to increase performance, and then counterbalancing that and hitting those other muscles so that those muscles can turn off and these muscles can then recover.
Yeah, I think quite possibly we could run into an issue where we create acute injuries that lead to chronic injuries by, say, taking that 2-to-1 pull-push ratio. Yep. Like, okay, so they're not pullers, so let's train them in pulling a lot more. Okay, that's fine. Right. At the end of the day, we might create some neutralized scapular dyskinesis.
Yep.
However, that might create so much fatigue on that tissue that when they go into combat state, that tissue is so strained that it's like, boom, pop, there it goes. There's an injury right there.
Yeah.
So we have to understand the actual requirements of the sport, the needs of the sport, and the needs of the athlete in that sport. Yes. I think a lot of times we say, oh, we have a fighter. Let's train him this way. Or we have a track athlete. Let's train him this way. We have a skier. Let's train him this way. But I think especially at the upper levels, nowadays, you just can't do it. Yeah, it's one athlete at a time.
And so many times you go to a gym and you see the athletes do exactly the same warm-up, right?
Right.
But they're very different. Like you said, energy systems, they're very different from injury standpoint. So, even looking back on our programs, I was looking at what an athlete was doing who was in ACL rehab for a warm-up. And what they did month 6 was the same thing they were doing month 7. And I was like, let's talk about this, because month 6 should be cleared from the rehab side. Month 7, we're working on completely different goals. And that warm-up has to change with those goals. So myself and like Marsh, our strength and conditioning, are literally going, and what we just identified is our 5 most common surgical injuries, our 5 most common non-surgical injuries. And then what we want to strategize is what that warm-ups looks like as that injury progresses, because that needs to be constantly changing as well. So we're really lucky to be able to have a facility where I can communicate with my strength and conditioning coach every day and come up with these big projects that, hopefully will shape more than just MMA, but shape, sports in general and things that we can continue to evolve on.
Right.
I think you're talking about something that isn't too often discussed. I think warm-ups, we glorifies, that's a great word. Glorify warm-ups.
Keep it going, player.
Warm-ups are meant to get blood to working tissues or tissues that will be worked, right? So if we're doing an entire body workout, which many of us do in strength and conditioning, we should be warming all tissues of the body.
Yeah.
Pretty simple. Increase heart rate, increase virility. So get someone to actually be able to breathe a little bit more, increase their overall cardiac output. Okay, so maybe there needs to be a little bit of an aerobic component. But we can also achieve that by just having short rests in anaerobic type work, whether they are dynamic stretches or they are just moving through full range of motion. But what people don't talk about is that could be the same for every single group, aside from what you just mentioned, rehabbing groups that can't achieve certain ranges of motion, right? So you're going to have to stage them out. And I think that's your PT brain speaking, right? You're thinking, okay, well, if this person doesn't have full range of motion yet, well, how could I possibly have them do a full range bodyweight squat? And they can't get there, right? So you have to adapt that. But I think on the other side, we're all chasing that. I found something really special, right? Every strength coach in the world, I found something really special. The reality is things really aren't that different, right? The basic patterns that worked back in the 50s and 60s with the Russians still work today. And it's the reason why they were strong then, and it's the reason why they're strong now. Including everyone else that trains along those patterns, if they can do so because there's not an injury preventing it, right? So I think we try to reinvent the wheel to be cool and niche and create this online persona that we're
a god or we're an expert in on the field. The reality is it really is simple.
Basic.
It's just choosing the right basic movements exactly
I've used
to achieve that goal.